Hey folks, thanks for joining us today. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes as we're getting a bunch of people just streaming in. Hope you're all doing well. All right, well, I think we'll formally get started here. Welcome everyone to the FINE Forum on Labor in the Farm to Institution Supply Chains. This is part one of a series on labor issues, this one focusing on prison labor and the need for transparency. My name's Peter Allison. I'm the executive director of FINE, and I'm really excited to be here as the moderator of our session today. Just to give you a sense of how the hour will go, after some introductions, I'm going to introduce our featured speaker, Claire Brown from The Counter, who's going to discuss her recent investigation to shed light on companies and institutions that source food products from behind prison walls, which form the basis of the three-part series that we shared, sourced from the inside. And then we'll have time for your questions and comments. And we'll wrap up with some information about some upcoming webinars and a reminder for all of you to fill out our survey. Want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, this session is being recorded. The recording will be available on our website along with some other resources that we'll share. We'll be using two features to increase our interactivity with all of you during the webinar. First of all, use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can use it for a few things. First of all, we'd love for all of you to introduce yourselves, tell us who you are, who you're with, your pronouns, and if you have specific links or information you'd like to share, feel free to use it for that. We'll also be posting some links to resources that are related to Claire's talk and to some of the work that we're doing. And secondly, use the Q&A feature if you want to ask a question of Claire. We'll have time at the end, as I mentioned, for questions or your comments. And if you put them there, it's a lot easier for us to find them and make sure we get them in the queue to bring up. So just a little bit about FINE. I think as many of you are familiar with us, we're a cross-sector network backbone organization that's working to mobilize the power of institutions to transform our food system. And specifically, we're focusing our work on 4 institutional sectors: K through 12 schools, college and universities, hospitals, and the correctional sector. And actually, we've just started some work working with partners in the early childcare education sector as well. But across all of our work, which includes research, events, communication, and advocacy, just to support the growing network of folks working in this field, there's sort of an underlying theme of working to promote transparency in the food system, identifying the barriers and promoting strategies to increase it. And that theme of transparency is very much front and center with our focus today. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for today, Claire Brown, who's going to talk to us about her research on transparency and the profound lack of it with regards to food that's produced in prisons. Claire is a senior staff writer for The Counter, an independent nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that focuses on shaping how and what America eats. Claire's work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Intercept, and has won numerous awards. Claire's a North Carolina native and now lives in Brooklyn. And she's going to talk with us about her series this past spring, Sourced from the Inside, which was recently recognized by Online Journalism Awards as a finalist in the explanatory reporting small newsroom categories. So congratulations, Claire, on the impressive work. And with that, let me turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. I'm really excited to talk with you all. I'm excited to see where you all are coming from in the chat. I see Leslie's in here, who was a source for this story. So Leslie, you'll have to interrupt me if I misquote any of the findings from your report. I'm going to share a slideshow, and then I will have time for questions when we're done. So just a quick note about The Counter before we get started. We're an independent nonprofit newsroom covering the forces shaping how and what America eats. Prior to the pandemic, we were based in New York, but now we're everywhere. We have staff in North Carolina, California, New York, Colorado, a couple other places as well. The best way to follow us is through our newsletter, which comes out twice a week. It's completely free, and you can sign up for that at thecounter.org. I always like to screenshot our homepage the day before a presentation like this, just to show folks a sense of what we're covering. I did a piece last week about Kimball Musk's school gardening nonprofit that laid off 10 staffers who had announced their intention to start a union. We published a piece about trauma-informed hunger relief a couple of days ago. We had a really wonderful piece about why it's so hard to get foreign language characters into cookbooks. So it had to do with the lettering and the software that publishers had access to. We've also covered avian flu and staff shortages in the last couple of days. So this was a 4-month investigation that I did earlier this year. We did in 5 months by the time we actually got everything published. And it started with a question from a reader. Was the milk in school lunches processed in a prison? It seemed pretty straightforward. I figured they were talking about public schools, and so I figured there would be a lot of public records outlining the contours of that supply chain. I was proven wrong very quickly. So I started out by creating a big spreadsheet with every single state on it. I looked at state websites called Departments of Corrections just to try and figure out which states were producing food, which states might be selling that food, and which states I might actually get information from. And so already in the first week of this investigation, I was learning a whole lot about how food production functions in prisons. I would find states that would have, a very high-end meat processing plant that would be teaching these really skilled $25 an hour positions to folks. And then there were kind of the types of situations you hear about more often, which are hot, sweaty working conditions in places like Louisiana, where the value for the incarcerated people is negligible, if any. So here are kind of the most basic outlines of food production in prison. There are more than 600 facilities nationwide that run some sort of agricultural operation. That includes landscaping work as well as some gardening. And so these aren't all huge farms. A relatively small amount of that food is sold to private companies that wind up in grocery stores and restaurants. So I found a little bit over $40 million over the course of a few years. That is not a complete snapshot of food that is sold to private companies, but it is minuscule in comparison to the total budget for running prisons in general, which I think was an estimated $80 billion last year. The remainder of the food that is not sold into the private supply chain is used within the prison system. And then, and this surprised me, it's sold to other public entities within a state. So that's nonprofits like Meals on Wheels, That's schools, that's hospitals, it's police departments. In some cases, it's other government entities like the fish being sold to a Fish and Wildlife Bureau. And then kind of the third way that food production interacts with the incarcerated workforce is that in a couple of places, there is a kind of public-private partnership where a private company is able to contract with a Department of Corrections or a correctional industries through a federal program called BICEP or a copycat initiative in the state of Idaho, where the companies pay the prevailing wage in the state, but they pay the DOC. And we'll talk about some of the withholding issues with that later. So those are kind of the key ways that food flows through this system. There's a little bit siphoned off for sales to private companies. There's most of it, which feeds, the system itself and public entities. And then there's, people moving off site every day to work for private companies. And that's kind of how this presentation will be organized. Okay, so one of the questions I get a lot about this series is how is this all legal? So the 13th Amendment, many of you are probably familiar, outlaws slavery except as the punishment for a crime. So a lot of states draw their authority to not pay folks for working from this amendment. The legislation that governs sales of goods manufactured in prison is the Ashurst-Sumner's Act. That was passed in 1935, right after the Depression. It actually prohibits the sale of food made in prisons across state lines. So this came about not because people were concerned about incarcerated workers and their working conditions. It came about because unions and small business owners were concerned that competitors would use incarcerated workers and be able to undercut their business. The Ashurst-Sumner's Act did include an exemption for agriculture, which is why we see food products float across state lines in a way that you don't see, say, license plates or furniture or other goods manufactured in prisons. There are other workarounds for the Ashurst-Sumner's Act. We've seen, a subsidiary company purchase goods made in the prison and then sell it to a national corporation. I didn't cover that much in this series, but there are various workarounds. And then at the state level, I just wanted to highlight, this is not a comprehensive list of all rules governing this, but some states have preferred purchaser policies. This might be relevant to folks working in food. Certain states do require public entities to purchase from prisons where possible. So we see this with dorm furniture. We see this with some food. I didn't uncover a whole lot of it in this, but it struck me as a relatively easy question to start asking states. Are colleges required to buy milk from prisons if it is available? Okay, I just wanted to share the art we commissioned for this piece. This is real footage from a prison work initiative in Colorado. And then this is some historical footage from Louisiana, which I touched on in part one of the piece. Okay, so part one of the piece focused on sales to private companies. And when I started looking into it, I realized there was this really big dust up back in 2015 that I needed to understand in order to understand why it's so hard to trace this supply chain. So back in 2015, it was reported that Colorado Correctional Industries was growing tilapia, and that tilapia was making its way to Whole Foods. The first place I could find this reported was in Pacific Standard magazine. It may have appeared elsewhere beforehand. It was actually a really complimentary piece talking about this kind of progressive system that Colorado had implemented. But someone named Michael Allen, the founder of In Mass Incarceration Houston, decided to start protesting Whole Foods for carrying this tilapia. He was basically saying, it was Whole Foods' responsibility to use its purchasing power to pressure the state of Colorado to pay people more through this program. Now, the backlash to that, the backlash to Whole Foods following that was mixed. Some people just didn't want Whole Foods to support incarcerated labor. Other people just felt ripped off because a Whole Foods supplier was using incarcerated labor and the tilapia was still expensive. So there was kind of this mixed reaction happening at the time. Whole Foods did respond by banning incarcerated labor from its supply chain. They basically said they wanted to support certain initiatives, but they felt like their customers were against this practice. And so they wanted to make their customers feel heard. It was kind of a wishy-washy statement. The interesting thing is that this ban didn't actually change the pay for people in Colorado or anything about the production. It just kind of meant that distributors stopped sharing the names of their customers. I got the Colorado records and called a bunch of people who showed up right on the records. Many of them hung up on me. The person who started buying the tilapia after the Whole Foods distributor dropped out actually advertises himself as a tropical fish purveyor, and he refused to tell me where he sells anything. Interestingly, I also spoke with a goat dairy who was working with the prisons at this time. And she actually sold to Whole Foods around the time that she was purchasing goat milk from prisons. It's not Haystack Mountain, the one in this, but it was interesting because she thinks she may have sold cheese to Whole Food after the ban was implemented while she was sourcing from prison, but she just had no idea that it was a rule. So that suggested to me that Whole Foods may not have particularly fallen through on the rule that it announced. Again, I'm not saying that this person, and she doesn't source from the prisons anymore, I'm not saying she intentionally violated any policy, but I am saying, you know, it seems that the policy was not particularly strongly enforced at the time. Okay, so this was kind of the backdrop against I was working. This is why I had a lot of hangups when I called people, particularly in Colorado. There was kind of this round of confusing press that led to a boycott, and the supply chain kind of went underground. So I started sending public records requests to various folks, various states who I thought might give me responses. They did not say, you know, Safeway, Wendy's, whatever. I would usually get the name of a distributor. And then I would kind of try to piece those puzzle pieces together. So I would look at recalls for that distributor, lawsuits, press reports. I would call them, but I was kind of at the mercy of whatever was available in the public and the cooperation of the distributor. I included Dairy Farmers of America on this screenshot. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So as I was piecing together these sales figures, I was able to compile kind of a top 10 list of private customers. The largest one by far was an egg farm. It's the largest egg farm in the Southwest. We'll talk about them more in a minute. The second largest was Dairy Farmers of America. The third was Taylor Farms, and I was able to learn a lot about who they supplied to because they had a recall in 2018, and so they were providing, you know, salad kits to Walmart and a bunch of other major grocery stores. Others included a livestock auction, Papa John's Produce, which has no relationship to the pizza company, but is actually a branch of Taylor Farms, Louis Dreyfus Commodities, Leprino Foods, which is a gigantic mozzarella company that is the exclusive supplier to Domino's, Papa John's, etc., and a few others. There were also major corporations like Cargill included in the data. They were smaller buyers, but I just found it interesting that a corporation that large would show up. Okay, I just wanted to do a quick tracing challenging spotlight on Dairy Farmers of America. So many of you may know they're a marketing conglomerate that controls 1/3 of all milk in the US. They were by far the largest purchaser of milk produced in prison. They were almost the exclusive purchaser in both Colorado and South Carolina. They did not respond to any of my questions, but I realized, you know, if I was going to get an answer about whether or not the milk that was served in schools was processed in a prison, this would likely be the place that I would find that answer. They do hold contracts, or held contracts at the time, with USDA to produce school milk, but they also produce a bunch of brands like Breakstones, like Warden, like Kilgore butter, the kind of fancy baking butter. But I couldn't get further than the name Dairy Farmers of America when I was going through the data. Okay, so all of this research got me wondering, what are the working conditions actually like in these situations? And I found that they varied quite widely. In the press reports from Colorado, people would speak really highly of their work. In places like Louisiana, there were strikes because managers were not providing enough water for people who were working on the farm in the summer. There was a report from Impact Justice that found huge discrepancies in self-reported work experiences. But that report and many of my sources made the point that, despite what the conditions are like, this work is inherently exploitative because the pay is so low and because it's largely often involuntary. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. I wanted to include this fantastic New Yorker story because it really dives deep into the experience of a handful of folks during the coronavirus working at a farm in a prison. I would recommend that read to anyone. Okay, so, and then again, how do those working conditions translate into COVID times? The most egregious situation I ran across was Hickman's family farm. That is the egg farm in Arizona. What happened at the beginning of the pandemic there was that Arizona Correctional Industries, which contracts with Hickman's, was basically on the verge of shutting down all of their correctional industries work. And Hickman's went to them and said, listen, we would like to house incarcerated workers on our farm for the duration of the pandemic. They basically just did not want their egg operations to be disrupted, and they invoked their status as an essential company to make the case that their production could not be stopped. So in a kind of extraordinary situation, Arizona Correctional Industries agreed to send a couple hundred incarcerated women to live in basically a warehouse on the egg farm for the duration of the pandemic. In fact, Arizona Correctional Industries even used incarcerated workers to build the bunk beds for that warehouse. This was something that actually the correctional officers union got very upset about, and they were the ones who revealed a few months later that there was a COVID outbreak in this facility. So that just kind of also indicates a little bit of tension between, the corrections who are supposed to be making decisions that, protect their incarcerated workers first and foremost, and the business interests of their client. Great, so limitations to tracking this private part of the supply chain. Some states just did not respond to my records request. In Florida, for instance, they have a ground meat processing facility. I had seen some reporting in The Nation from several years ago that said that ground meat ended up in school lunches. And so I really wanted to get a sense of whether that was still happening. They refused to respond to my records request. They said I would have to sue them if I wanted the data. I was able to find, because they had a recall in the last few years, I was able to find a couple of grocery stores that had carried their meat. And again, it's not branded as Florida Pride, it's branded under a different brand name. Another obvious limitation is that companies did not really want to talk to me about who their customers were. I think largely because of the backlash in 2015 and kind of the political climate in 2021. So I included just a graphic from the story here. The person who buys pretty much all of the tilapia in both Wyoming and Colorado would only tell me that he sells to restaurants and ethnic supermarkets. And so I really could not get any further beyond that line of questioning with him. So that was frustrating. Okay, so that is kind of the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, it's only $40 million worth of sales. The vast majority of food that is produced in prison, my reporting revealed, is actually consumed, within corrections and sold to the public sector. So I filed a bunch of public records requests to figure out where within the public sector that was going. Every state has a little bit of different rules about where correctional industries can sell. Some allow any accredited nonprofit to buy. Some have some tight restrictions around who can buy. It varies quite a bit. So I would encourage you, if you're researching your own state, to look that up. So public sector sales get a lot less intense backlash than private sales. The best way this was explained to me was an activist who called sales to private companies hyper exploitation, because he said you can, and this was James Kilgore, he's an abolitionist and a formerly incarcerated activist. He was basically saying, you know, these instances of hyper exploitation, which is quite rare, are ones where you can draw a direct line between a profit for a company and the exploited labor of an incarcerated worker. Those lines get a little bit blurrier when you start talking about public sales. It's often framed as a cost savings for taxpayers or taxpayer savings. It's largely been debunked that these types of sales save money. The cost of incarcerating a single person is still you know, more than a minimum wage salary for a person in a year. There's a lot of data showing that the food is not very healthy. There's a lot of data showing that food factories run by states are not economically efficient. I didn't get too much into that. I just wanted to note that that had been debunked. Another thing that states like to say is that they're providing skills training or on-the-job training in some cases, like in the case of meatpacking plants and arguably goat dairies, it really is specialized. In other cases, like when you're having people just pick row crops or weed by hand, not so much. And there's a lack of data following these job opportunities, even if they are robust. And so a lot of times administrators will make this case, but then not bother to collect the data to support it. This is an image from Calpia. I wanted to just shine a spotlight on California. The other main criticism of, you know, public sales of goods or using incarcerated labor for the public good is that it creates a conflict of interest for politicians. So Kamala Harris, when she was an attorney general, not her personally, but her office did lobby against shrinking the prison workforce because they said, you know, they would lose cheap labor. She very quickly distanced herself from that as soon as she was called out for it in public, but it has been kind of brought up as a way to rationalize continuing these systems. Calpia also had a lot of problems during the pandemic. Folks who worked in the food factory talked to the LA Times about how they didn't feel like they could opt out of work because of health concerns, because they would worry that their sentence would be extended or they would be sentenced to solitary confinement. Okay. Okay, so these public records requests largely did not show sales to schools in the way we might have expected based on that original question. There wasn't a huge secret milk supply chain that we uncovered. The ice cream at the University of Wisconsin is made with heavy cream. That's a byproduct of the dairy that the nearby prison runs. Virginia Tech also serves milk that is processed by incarcerated people. I believe the cows are actually milked on Virginia Tech campus, and then it goes to a processing facility and comes out. I found a handful of public schools in Virginia and a Boy Scout camp in Virginia, but I did not see, you know, gigantic university systems or university cafeterias purchasing this food. I did see lots of sales to state-run hospitals, outpatient clinics, food banks, and other correctional facilities. This is online. It's just kind of a map showing a smattering of some of the most interesting data points from this. Arkansas prisons sell their eggs to Oklahoma prisons. The biggest buyer of food produced in Georgia's prison is Aramark, totaling more than $2 million in 2019 and 2020. Now, Aramark is a private food service provider for the Georgia Department of Corrections, and so they are required to buy food from the Georgia Department of Corrections. It is not clear if that food is then only served in departments of corrections facilities or if it's also served elsewhere. Maryland has a meat processing facility where the food goes to the School for the Deaf, among other, state-run institutions. Washington State Correctional Industries, which I'll talk about more in a minute, reported $49 million in burrito sales alone between 2018 and 2020. And New Jersey's prison bakery sells a bunch of cupcakes. I did not get data for New Jersey or New York. New Jersey's just never came in, and New York quoted a very high price point for a response to my records request. So I decided not to follow up on that. Okay, so quick spotlight on Washington. I got in touch with Ricardo De Leon. He was a manager in a food factory in Washington State. So Washington Correctional Industries runs 2 food factories in prisons in the state. De Leon managed the burrito line. So it's a conveyor belt where you put the tortilla and then you put the filling and someone wraps it and then it drops into like a quick freezer and it goes everywhere. He said Meals on Wheels. He said other prisons. As we saw, $49 million in burrito sales in 3 years. So it's a lot of burritos. He oversaw a couple of dozen people. So when the pandemic hit in early 2020, he grew very concerned about Washington Correctional Industries' response. They were not implementing social distancing. They were not providing enough hand sanitizer. They were not requiring that people change their gloves. He tried to organize other kind of managers to talk to management about this, to get them to at least reduce quotas so that they could either let fewer staff into the building or work more slowly in order to allow, better sanitation, better enforcement of rules about mask wearing. He didn't get much of a response, and one of his employees actually came to work feeling ill. And it was several days. That person ended up having COVID, but it was several more days before Washington Correctional Industries shut down the food factory. De Leon did end up contracting COVID later. He was asymptomatic, and the food factory was eventually permanently shut down. And what I learned looking more into Washington was that this kind of outsourcing of the food supply to correctional industries had created a lot of much deeper problems with the health outcomes of the incarcerated people. There were families who I talked to who were trying to organize around this. They were saying, all of the food is processed. It wasn't always like this. In January 2019, it reached the level of the Ombuds office doing a report. This was just a snapshot of a couple of quotes from people who talked to those investigators. Basically, folks were just saying, get rid of CI. I can taste the glue seal. So Washington has now closed one of those food factories. They were not very clear when I reached out to them about why it was closed. De Leon seemed to think it was more of an economic inefficiency thing than a COVID concern thing. But his situation kind of shows the tension between, policymakers prioritizing production over the health of their workers. And, on a broader level, the state prioritizing perceived cost savings over fresh food. And then I just included another quote from James Kilgore here. He said, in a bigger picture, this tells you that the system itself has certain financial obligation that it needs to carry out, whether those are selling goods to other state institutions or producing goods for the institution itself in order to be viable. Those are the priorities. The welfare of the people inside is really marginalized. His point was largely that, a lot of these systems become self-perpetuating after a long time. So, focusing on sales to private companies can obscure a larger conversation about kind of shrinking the size of the prison overall. When you end up with this beast that needs to feed itself and others, it just becomes more and more entrenched and makes the conflict between the welfare of the people who are working and administrators even more intense. Okay, so part 3, public-private partnerships. I'm going to talk quickly about a small federal program that allows correctional industries or departments of corrections to allow private companies to hire workers that are, bused daily to a facility to do work outside. Now, this program, I didn't put the date, it was established, I think it was in the 70s. It's essentially meant to allow for more professional development among incarcerated workers. On paper, it looks really good. Private companies pay prevailing wages, so it's not minimum wage, it's determined based on a calculation. So, looking at these wages, it's $12, $13, $14 an hour. However, corrections departments are allowed to keep up to 80% of that money for room and board, for transportation. I think taxes is included in that number. And so the amount that people take home is actually, in many cases, just as small as it is in other jobs. There is a state level copycat program that only works with agricultural companies that was launched in Idaho. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, here's just a quick video showing the cost breakdown of the garnished wages. I'm gonna play it and I'll be quiet.
Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program rules allow corrections departments to withhold up to 80% of workers' wages. In Idaho, for example, the State Department of Corrections has taken advantage of these deductions. It kept 25% of workers' total gross wages for room and board, garnished an additional 31% of money for victims programs, including court-ordered restitution in the fourth quarter of 2020, the most recent data available, 5% for family support, and 14% for taxes. The total deductions are nearly 75% of a worker's gross wages, leaving only 25% as take-home pay. Of that, an additional 59% are put into a mandatory savings account. Here's a hypothetical breakdown of someone who makes $7.80 per hour. $1.95 goes to room and board, $2.42 to victims programs, 39 cents to family support, $1.09 to taxes, and $1.15 to mandatory savings, leaving 80 cents left.
Oops.
Prison industry.
Sorry about that. Okay, so BICEP is actually a little bit more transparent than some of the other initiatives that I was looking after. There's a quarterly report of every company that participates in BICEP that's published quarterly. Probably the biggest one that works in food is Dickinson Frozen Foods in Idaho. They supply a quote who's who of processed food makers. They hired 244 workers in Q1 2021. Again, they didn't answer the phone and they haven't had any recalls. So I had trouble tracing the potatoes or the processed potatoes, which is what they're making, and processed onions very far past the plant. According to a lawsuit, they did supply the onions in Wendy's chili back in 2007. It might have been 2009. I queried Wendy's directly about this and they did not get back to me. I was also able to link them to Stouffer's, but that was kind of as far as I got, which was frustrating because it's a huge amount of potatoes that are moving through the system that I simply could not keep track of. Idaho, where Dickinson is, also has a copycat and program that includes a bunch of potato processors, a meat packing plant, and a couple of orchards. Just as a quick aside, a 2021 CDC report found that work release program in Idaho, which is very similar to the BICEP program, seeded outbreaks in prisons because incarcerated workers would work alongside non-incarcerated colleagues and then bring the virus back to the prison. Okay, so just another quick note on sourcing issues. I tried every which way to trace potatoes that were going through these processors. You may be familiar with the way potatoes are sold in most grocery stores. They are usually not branded and not labeled. And so a lot of these potatoes are just kind of processed and then sent out into the world. I was able to link, Walmart, Amazon, Safeway, most of the major retailers to at least one of the handful of processors. I was able to find these potatoes being used in Five Guys fries by cross-referencing the Instagram page of one of the potato companies with a Five Guys Yelp review. But for the most part, you really lose track of these potatoes in the food supply as soon as they leave the warehouse. And the departments of corrections really have no interest in tracking this stuff any further. Just a quick spotlight on New England. I looked up the BICEP participants in the 6 states of New England. I only found 2 that were registered in Q1 2021. If you look at this main clip on the left-hand side, there are several companies that are registered. There's a weighted blanket company, Grandpa's Garden. Those actually reported that they're not employing anyone right now. The only listed company is an upholstery company in Warren, Maine, finishing furniture. In New Hampshire, there's a contract manufacturer that's hiring 41 incarcerated people. One other interesting thing is that in places like New Hampshire, when there's only one active company, you can cross-reference this report with another report to see how much of incarcerated workers' wages are being garnished. So there's another report on the same website that I can share that has, an aggregate number of total wages, total withheld for every column. That's how we made that video. So you can kind of figure out basic wage levels from there. Okay, so I just wanted to widen the lens in my last few minutes here. What does it mean that people in prison are working? I think a lot of people take for granted that people work in prison, but a bunch of my sources for this story said that's not supposed to be part of the deal. You're not supposed to go to prison and provide free labor to the state or to a private company. The folks that I interviewed for this story said, in the past, it was really supposed to be about rehabilitation. And what has happened over the last 30, 40 years is that libraries have disappeared from prisons, educational programs have disappeared from prisons. The educational programs that do exist now are happening through the lens of work. So I found the sociologist Erin Hatton really helpful in terms of thinking about this. She basically wrote a book called Coerced and says, any work under the threat of punishment is coerced labor. That applies to workfare recipients who have to prove that they're working to receive public benefits like SNAP and Medicaid. It applies to, she argues, college athletes because their school does not pay them, and it has a lot of control over their prospects for the draft. I think that's changing now as there's a debate playing out with NCAA athletes, but she writes, like all Americans, prisoners are culturally expected to fulfill a moral obligation to work, the shirking of which, perceived or real, has long been used to justify exclusion from the rights of productive citizenship, she writes. And the criteria for this kind of forced work that she writes about is poor pay, lack of autonomy, and mistreatment at work. So I found that really helpful in parsing some of the different programs that I was looking at. There were some that really did seem to be genuinely believing that they were engaging in something rehabilitative, something educational, but even those were fit her kind of poor pay and lack of autonomy criteria, because in many cases, people who are quote unquote able-bodied are not able to opt out of work if they are asked to do so. I talked to someone in Connecticut who she writes a blog called Prison Diaries. She was incarcerated, I think in 2000, and I think she was released in 2006. I would have to check that, but she wanted to use her time while she was incarcerated to write a book and think about some things, and she was essentially like drafted to work in the commissary, and she really hated it at first and couldn't understand why she wasn't able to opt out. And she ended up changing her mind about that, but I thought that was an interesting example. Okay, just a quick how-to on researching your own state. Call the Department of Corrections and ask questions, call correctional industries and ask questions. I found many, many times that there was a discrepancy between what they put online and what was happening in real life. If you are in a position to be a purchaser of food, either at an institutional level or at an individual level, you may have more power in getting answers from private companies who didn't respond to questions from a reporter. You can follow the quarterly BICEP reports to see what's happening in your state in terms of contracts with individual businesses. And lastly, preferred purchaser policies. If your state is engaging in prison food production, are there entities that have to buy that food if they are trying to source that product? All right, I think that's all I've got. I can take questions now. Here's the series URL and my email. I will send you all a PDF to this presentation if that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Claire. That was really informative and a great amplification on your series. We do have a few questions that have come in and I'd like to share those with you. The first one is from Daniela Jock, who asks about where the data came from on how many correctional facilities have agricultural production programs. You mentioned 600 in the report. But how did you sleuth that one out?
So I can't take credit for that. That is from a researcher named Josh Zbika. He's in Colorado. He is starting an initiative. I don't know if they have a website yet, called the Prison Agriculture Initiative. I would have to double check that. The title is in the story, but he actually did that research. And so I just used his number.
Great, thanks. And then Kevin Dawson asks, says great research. And whether you know if any similar types of research has been done with folks who are mentally or physically disabled in the food industry.
You know, I have not run across anything similar. I would be very curious if anyone in the chat has. I think, you know, there are a lot of very similar questions that folks can ask there, and I would be very curious about that kind of research.
Very great. I'm wondering if you would amplify a little bit. You mentioned at the end, if people are want to do research, if they're in a position to be purchasers, and obviously a lot of our network members do buying for various institutions. And you mentioned actually there's more institutional procurement than private company procurement of prison produced food. Any specific guidance on, you know, how somebody involved in procurement would go about asking that question or finding that information based on your experience?
Yeah, you know, I think if it were private procurement, it would be relatively straightforward to say, you know, I've seen your company is associated with this company who's associated with this supply chain. And, you know, do you know anything more about that? Or do you know any of the specifics? Like there were certain companies that I ran across, like Dairy Farmers of America, where I had a sense that they probably knew exactly where that milk went and just didn't want to share. On the other hand, there were companies like Cargill that was very frank with me. Well, I'm assuming this is true, but they said, you know, we buy commodity soy and it gets exported. And as soon as it's mixed in with the rest of the commodity soy we buy, we don't know where it goes. So I think, you know, companies themselves also have to do a little bit more work to keep an eye on this stuff.
To follow the crumbs a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how about in terms of your own research? You must have unturned a lot of stones as you're going through this work. Does it open up some other avenues or questions that you're hoping to pursue down the road?
Yeah, there's so much there. You know, the egg farm in particular kept bringing things up. I ran across an old plan to, you know, create kind of transitional housing for workers who were leaving the prison system. And it just struck me as, you know, transitioning into transitional housing provided by your employer could be a really complicated set of circumstances. And so I didn't have time to follow up on whether that actually happened. Another thing that I ran across, which I found really surprising, is in an old budget, I think for Arkansas, that they were considering partnering with the meatpacking plants. I assumed it was Tyson, though Tyson was not mentioned by name in the budget, to start growing, broiler houses in prisons. And it didn't happen. It disappeared from the budget the next year. But that was just kind of one of those things. I ran across it in the fact checking process and I was like, what? And I didn't have a chance to report it out. So I think there's a lot of little crumbs like that, and I continue to have Google alerts for all of this stuff, just to kind of get a sense of, there's all kinds of brand new business arrangements that companies will make to get around some of these regulations. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Interesting. So actually another question that just got posted relates to meeting other requirements. And actually it's a really great question for us at Fine, because we support a lot of initiatives to promote local procurement and state local procurement rules. Did anything come up in your research that indicated, well, if there's prison production going on in our state, we can count that as local procurement? Or did that issue ever come up where people are trying to utilize? We do know that, for example, in Maine, one of the 6 New England states, there's a state law that 20% of the food that institutions buy needs to be from Maine by 2025. And we know that the Department of Corrections is starting to track the food that they're producing as well as that they're buying from other vendors. But I was curious if that came up in any other parts of the country in your research.
That's an amazing question. So I did not find much local procurement with food. So I was chasing that for a long time because there was some really good reporting about universities and dorm furniture. And I was like, oh, it'd be so easy to replicate this. However, the data that I got from the states that responded to my records request just did not show that much food, particularly with universities. So I didn't see a whole lot of it, but I would be very curious about that. The other thing that I'm very curious about is, and I haven't got an answer from this, but there's a Biden executive order about a $15 minimum wage for anyone who contracts with the federal government. And so, first of all, I don't know if entities like food production companies count as contractors. I emailed the Department of Labor and haven't heard back, but second of all, does that $15 minimum, could that conceivably have an impact on wages of incarcerated people, which is a pretty big stretch. There's a lot of points between A and B, but I do think there's a lot of interesting ways to look at interplay between state, federal, and local regulations to see, which might apply in these situations that aren't actually applying yet.
That's really interesting. As we talked a little bit earlier, we're on the lookout for other policies that are being proposed around the region, around the country, to improve the living conditions of those who are incarcerated, or the food supply chain. The working conditions obviously is also very relevant, and how folks are paid. And I was curious if there's any other policy issues, like the one that you just mentioned is really interesting, whether they would exempt folks who are incarcerated, or if that would sort of apply to the PICEP, the prevailing wages, if that would have to be considered sort of the proxy for prevailing wage, if that executive order actually goes into effect, and if these facilities are included. But curious if you're seeing any other sort of food-related policy issues related to the carceral system as you sort of scanned looking for this particular line of thought.
One thing I did run across was in California, which has, kind of a Washington-style food factory. There's an initiative there to just kind of raise wages across the board for incarcerated workers. I think California, incarcerated workers in California are often in the spotlight because many of them fight fires out there. And so it's kind of more present for a lot of people in California than in other states. Beyond that, I didn't run across a whole lot of food specific policy initiatives, but I would be very curious to learn more about if other folks in the audience have seen more.
Yeah, and we are, to all of you out there, we are really interested in hearing about issues that are coming up in your work that's related to both Claire's topic and the broader issues around well, farm to institution and and food in the carceral system as well. We're nearing the end of the time. I would love to get into some of the broader philosophical conversations around, there's a lot of people who are involved in issues related to sort of the abolition of our prison system. And then there's a lot of people who are working to improve the conditions for those who are in. And there's sometimes a little bit of a tension that, are we propping up a system? And you as a reporter, by shining a light, I don't know if that's quite as consistent, but just curious your thoughts on how shining a light on, working to have people paid a fair wage or to make sure that there's transparency, how does that relate to the broader issue of what do we do about our carceral system? So in a minute or less, if you have.
Just in a minute or less. No, I think, it's a really important set of questions. James Kilgore, who I quoted a couple of times in this presentation, is actually against raising the wages of incarcerated workers in California because it just puts more money into the prison system instead of shrinking it overall. I think, also a lot of abolitionists take issue with the notion that prisons exist to provide cheap labor to corporations. And I tried throughout this series to emphasize the fact that it was a relatively small piece of the pie, although not insignificant, simply because I think it's something people don't know about it. And that's kind of our newsworthiness. It met our newsworthiness threshold, but it brought up a lot of really thorny questions about how to engage with this work. And I don't really have any answers about that.
Well done. And thank you so much for presenting and taking these questions. We look forward to some additional discussion and ongoing collaboration with you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen because I want to show people about some other upcoming events we have. But just before I do, say thank you once again.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Hoping that works. And that you folks are seeing a screen that talks about some other upcoming webinars that FIND's hosting. I also want to take a moment to give a shout out to Mignot Mulugeta, who is a graduate student at UVM, worked with FIND this summer as a project associate, and who made the initial outreach to Claire and helped us to start the discussions to bring this webinar to fruition. So, if you're taking a break from your studies right now, thank you once again for all of that effort. As noted here, we have a couple of webinars coming up on campus food security issues. The first one is October 20th on creating and sustaining food pantries, and another one that's focused on the Bunker Hill Community College and partners efforts. And then we have a follow-up to Claire's talk related to labor in the farm to institution supply chains, focusing on worker-driven social responsibility models. And then another one, which is sort of useful tools with the USDA National Agricultural Library, talking about the resources that are available through their extensive library system that everyone has access to. And we'll be posting more information and the dates on all of those in the very near future. And lastly, we just want to say, feel free to continue the conversation, following us through and contributing on social media, emailing us, the Dining Operators listserv. We can get information on that. And also, you'll get a survey for this webinar that will pop up on your screen momentarily. And we'd love you to just take a couple minutes to tell us what you thought. We really value that information. With that, I will say, thanks very much. This will be recorded. We'll be posting the information and related resources on our website soon. And hope you all have a great rest of the day.